And we'll begin with the practice that we've been using for all of the sessions, which is find your seat, find the ground with your feet as you are able, and place one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly. And find your breath. You don't have to change your breath. You don't have to speed it up or slow it down. Just notice your breath and ask yourself, what are my head, my heart, and my body telling me right now? What are my head, my heart, and my body telling me right now? And with your next breath, what is the deeper need beneath that information from your head, your heart, and your body? What is the deeper need beneath that information from your head, your heart, and your body? How would you describe that need if you had to verbalize it? How would you describe that need or those needs if you had to verbalize it? And with your next breath, what is my goal for participating tonight? What is my goal for participating tonight? And with your next breath, you can return your attention to the room. And I invite you to turn to someone near you and share a little bit about your goal for being in the conversation tonight. All right, I'll bring your attention back. I'm going to ask you to visualize. I'm going to ask you to visualize. So go ahead and close your eyes. Imagine a wealthy person. Imagine a wealthy person. Imagine a person who needs a loan. Imagine a person who needs a loan. Imagine a person who gives a loan. Imagine someone who gives a loan. Imagine someone who has 3 late unpaid bills. Imagine someone who has 3 late unpaid bills. Imagine someone with a cash savings more than $10,000. Imagine someone with a cash savings of more than $10,000. Imagine a homeowner. Imagine a homeowner. Go ahead and open your eyes. What was coming up as you did some imagining? What was coming up for you as you did some imagining? I'm muting us for this conversation. I'm primarily just recording myself tonight. Why do you think I started asking you to visualize people in those categories?
Starts with our version of what we see, so that we're ready to
Yes.
think beyond.
Yes, it starts with your version of what you might see in a conversation about economic class. Angela,
I think the media is really good at telling us stories about what wealthy looks like, what poor looks like, what somebody looks like when you no longer figure out. We have lots of baggage connected with those, and just sort of starting by slowing down and letting them through our actions that's more aware of those continuing stories.
Yeah, so we have our story, we have the stories we've ever been told, we have the narratives we subscribe to, we have the narratives that are being pushed on us. One of the things that's true about the US is we have this obsession with a middle class or the middle class, and many of us are running toward identifying as being part of middle class. So one of the narratives that we get pushed a lot in media and in politics is about who the middle class is and whether or not we should or do belong to it. The Pew research I'm familiar with is if your household income exceeds $140,000 a year, you are no longer middle class. You've moved out of middle class. So it's like whatever I feel like, and then there's the annual cash that my home has access to. How about others? Thoughts about why do you think I started with having you visualize some of those things? Yeah.
I think in part it relates to what Pauline was saying. In one's own history, these are categories that you can identify with over time in different ways. Class is both mutable and immutable. I mean, you can move in and out of the identity in ways that we don't necessarily move in and out of other identities.
Yeah, classes, we can be fairly mobile in our experience of class over the course of our lifetime. And we live in a society that really gives, so Angela talked about narratives and media messages. We live in a society that absolutely talks to us like we should all have the goal of being upwardly mobile. That it is the generation before us, it's their job to get us economically better than they were, and it's our job to do better than they did so that we can leave a house and an inheritance for the next generation. And it talks to us like it's our job and our fault. So we really get talked to as individuals in an economic system that really benefits from us as thinking as solo operators in the system. Because if we think of ourselves as too connected, we might say, the wealth is far too concentrated among a small handful of people, right? I would say it. Other thoughts on why we begin there? So the wonky reason, so all of those answers were right. And next to that is also the thing about how bias and biology work. So a few of you talked about resisting one image or resisting the activity as a whole. And what's true is the first notion that flashed through your mind, whether it was visual or words or concepts or a headline or a character from media or politics or something, the truth is the first notion, even if we resist it, that notion had a race, had a gender, had an age, and maybe other things. So for some of us, we're like, I don't like that I thought of a white man when I thought of wealthy. I think there could be other kinds of wealthy people, right? I don't like that I thought of fill in the blank when I thought of someone with late bills. So even though some of us feel incongruent in terms of our values of that first notion or that first image, it still comes because we're wired to sort, we're wired to move toward what is familiar and away from what is unfamiliar. And sometimes what is familiar is an image, is a notion about who is supposed to be and who is not supposed to be any one of these things, which is why we talk about race and class together, which is why I've been harping on the inextricable link between race, gender, class, religion, and sexuality through the whole series. Because the notion of an American economy is directly connected to our worth, and our worth is about our proximity to whiteness, our proximity to masculinity, our proximity to procreation, all of those things being about being a good white Christian person. So they all go together. And there have been a lot of attempts, good liberal attempts, to really look at our country's problems through when people say, like, let's just take an economic approach to this. This isn't about race, this is more about class. Well, who are those poor families? And who has been kept poor on purpose? And who are the families who, because of the nature of how they've been kept out of certain systems, are more likely, as KP talked about, navigating an economy between and among their own cultural group and avoiding interactions with systems and structures to pay them, right? So the creation of the American economy needed whiteness and masculinity at the center so that wealth and power could be accumulated and hoarded. So that's why we talk about race and class together. We can't separate them because the initial notion of having an American economy said, you've heard me say this, the most worthy person of building wealth, owning land, owning people are white men. So economies in other places on the globe might have origins or roots that are different. They might have caste systems whose origins are different. We have a caste system that is a racialized caste system. So, Jesse, can I?
I'm going to ask about that word caste.
Yeah.
Why did it take this long to get to it? Why don't I hear that anywhere else? I don't hear it in church. It seems like very obviously a caste system.
Yeah.
And it should be named as such. Why is that word so far out?
Oh, we could do a whole Tuesday night on that. I have some thoughts. I would love to hear what other people think about this question. So my initial thoughts are, one, it is getting a little more popular. There's a book out right now called Caste. And part of why I think some folks like it is because they can name the book. They don't have to say white fragility, because that was the other popular book a couple years ago. Now they can say, reading that book about caste, right? So it's gaining popularity. I think the other piece is for some people to admit we have a caste system would put us in proximity to countries we look down on. And we talk about caste as far away or separate or distant or bad. We don't do that. This is a meritocracy. You work hard, you move up. Not there, you're predetermined, you're predestined. So we don't admit to ourselves as a country that there's predetermination and predestined nature of who's ever been able to build wealth. But I'd love to hear other thoughts on why don't we easily talk about having a caste system? Thoughts?
That was my thought.
Yeah.
Very rich stories about
Yeah. That would mean somehow our American experiment has failed if we had a caste system, if we admitted we had a caste system.
Having done an 8-week deep dive with inspired and other people into the book, I think it's all, I mean, it's just a huge, but like it is saying we have a caste system is one thing, but connecting the dots between history we were not taught fielded from. And what a caste system is requires us to do a whole bunch of mythologizing of these things to be historians, and that becomes very complex and so people like the meritocracy.
Yeah, we're like, oh, interesting, reducing a complex problem into a finite.
Yeah, I mean, that's like inheritance by pornography, right? And so when we're confronted with the people who've been able to do that, they're always sort of put on this little pedestal, and we're not thinking, okay, they may have made this, but I can't all of their friends do this well.
Yes.
I'm not thinking about that. And all of the stuff in history that we don't get taught. I mean, nobody wants their kids to feel bad about their history or feel bad about their country, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, my friend Sam Blackwell talks about white supremacy as really infantilizing. So we treat ourselves and each other like we're incapable of knowing the hard truth of our history.
there are entire having grown up Catholic, and lay that out there, you know, they purposely, you know, teach you as a child, you're supposed to obey as
Yeah.
follow the rules.
Order, control, right? You know, in the re-release of Tima Okune's White Supremacy Culture, there's a piece that's easy to miss because it's long and she's quickly trying to acknowledge several things. And she talks about white supremacy culture actually being about a demand that we all conform to upper and owning class whiteness. So it's sort of she talks about the nature of punching up and punching down inside of whiteness, so that we can think about there's good white people and bad white people. It's where the notion of white trash comes from. So you're not a good kind of white person because you're not close enough to wealth. You should be closer to wealth. And capitalism needs angry white people, angry poor and working poor white people to be successful. So be mad at immigrants, be mad at people of color, be mad at queer and trans people, be mad at women in the workplace, so that you don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain who has all of those roles that we imagine, right? Do you? Yeah.
It rests on, as a book I read one time, people, expansion, exploitation, and oligarchy.
Works for me. Extraction.
So, like, do you have that?
I think about capitalism for sure as, you know, I talk about control of land, labor, and the economy. So that's what whiteness needs: control of land, stealing the continent, control of labor, enslaving Africans, and then exploiting workers, and then controlling the economy. Well, if I'm the most worthy kind of person, I get to tell you when and where and how to work. I get to tell you what to do with your body. I get to tell you where you get to live. And I get to make money while I'm telling you how to do all these things. And you should want to make money while I'm controlling. It's my definition.
I'm sorry to be a bug, but doesn't the Chinese Communist Party do that too? Like, don't they control those three things and
Yeah.
don't identify as capitalism?
Well,
I know the
I am not an expert on the geopolitical nature of how the Chinese economy works. And I think anyone claiming collectivist values while hoarding power is just, what's the phrase, putting lipstick on a pig? Like, because collectivist economic models don't believe power should be heavily concentrated and don't believe people should be controlled by other people. So all economic systems have historically been used to abuse and control in the name of meritocracy, collectivism, shared values. Now you're really seeing my, like, I'm way left. So I think it's important that we have our relationship to economic class and our relationship to money as a site of struggle, because it can be one way that white dominant groups distance themselves from racism and sexism and homophobia. Because groups can turn back to places where they've experienced discomfort, suffering, or struggle through the lens of money. Well, yeah, racism, but I was on scholarship in college. Well, yeah, racism, but my parents worked 5 jobs. Yeah, racism, but, right? And again, what intersectionality tells us is it isn't but, it's and. It's and. That if someone is a white person who's experienced economic hardship, that's on purpose, because currently what was at one point a majority white country, and this slowly wasn't, and then was, and then is about to not be again, needs folks who subscribe to whiteness to be mad about the economic station of people of color, about the economic opportunity of immigrants, about what it might be like for queer and trans people to be fully expansively ourselves in the American workplace. So we have to reflect on our relationship and connection to class and to money.
I'm not sure, that's a very long day. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to articulate this well in a moment. I'm wondering if you can say something about how we identify class, whether our own or assumed class status of others, based on signifiers other than money. Like, how does the role of higher education play into this? Because sometimes I think we accord people a higher class status because they have multiple graduate degrees, even though they're currently working as an academic professor somewhere and making in the low academic figures. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of ways that we're trying to guess maybe what someone's socioeconomic status is. There are a lot of indicators or signifiers we all look at that are partially about money, but they're about other things too. And how does that intersect with what you're describing?
Yeah, you're pulling on a very nuanced concept in some ways, which is there's access to wealth and there's benefit of proximity to certain economic classes or castes. So I trade in and I move in and I am palatable in an economic class echelon like me, Alfonso, that does not match the amount of wealth I have access to. So some might assume if they saw where I live, the car I have, that I have this laptop, that I dress a certain way, that I have a phone, that you might run into me at X, Y, or Z restaurant out in the community, and you might say, he is this class and has access to this kind of wealth. Part of that is about working class parents who really wanted me to go to Catholic school, who told me to get a job when I was 16, and then this guy recruiting me at a recruitment fair and giving me a job I had no business having when I was 20, and then him teaching me how to dress well to work in a philanthropic space, right? So there's all these things that other people did about trying to help me be successful. And then when I think about how much cash I ever have at any given moment and how much cash my family and I have access to, it's way less than the world I move in. And our class experience is related to the school we went to, the kinds of topics we would have access to talking about. One of the stories I tell about myself is when I first started working at a foundation, I would drive in every morning in my 1998 Oldsmobile Achieva, and with the steering wheel that fell in my lap every mile or so. And I would listen to a radio station that the Twin Cities had at the time called B96. B96 was a rap and hip hop station that me and most of my friends were listening to. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to the stuffy office. I got to get like amped up and hyped up. And then I would go to the office. It was a small team of like 4 or 6 of us. And everyone was talking about NPR. And did you hear? And did you know? And did you listen? And the recipe and the this and, you know, art hounds, and blah, 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 and all this stuff. And I was like, people talk on the radio? I had never listened. In my own car, I had never listened to public radio. And I was like, I don't think they know about my station, but they think I'm supposed to know about their station because they talk to me like everybody knows about Minnesota Public Radio. And people like us, we're pulling you in to this particular class situation, people who were all at the time 30 and 40 years older than me, who really wanted me to fit in, really wanted to feel welcomed. So what did they do? They talked to me about the stuff they traded in. Vacations, cars, public radio, Hillary Clinton. Pretty much it. Food sometimes. So that I started to learn the vocabulary of those things. And I thought, oh, to be successful, I have to know about these things and care about them. So I have a vocabulary and an ease and a familiarity with a bunch of stuff. That means I can move in certain spaces, but I don't have the same money, right? And so a bunch of us are often trying to figure out, how can people know that I'm not as rich as they might think I am? We all want to be seen as not so rich, not so wealthy, not so much having access, rather than saying, part of my struggle around class and money is I'm pretty palatable in pretty wealthy spaces. I have all 3 Pohlad brothers and all 3 Dayton's phone numbers in my cell phone because of the jobs I've had. That's just true about like who I can get to. And they're not like friends. And here I go being like, but I'm not like, ugh, right? But I've had jobs where I'm in proximity to these people, and to be palatable to them, I need to have a certain vocabulary, and I have to remember my place. And I have to be honest with myself about, what do I actually have access to? Where am I experienced as comfortable? Where do people experience me as sending cues that I don't belong? So I bring us back to our own experiences of class and money, because a lot of how we try to project ourselves has to do with not so much just our access to wealth, but also the images we project, the values we have, the behaviors we have. And they may or may not be directly related to the amount of money we ever had, the amount of money we currently have, or the money we might have, but they're rooted in our values related to money. So I'm going to bring us into another activity.
Can I share a story real quick?
Sure.
So my boy's jujitsu works a labor job. His wife, he has a one-person team. They own their house outright, pulling probably $6 grand a month out of his jujitsu business with 0 employees. So he's got 2 jobs. I'm sure he's loaded, but he talks loudly about going to buy a Rolex because he's not college educated. He doesn't present class, but he's cash rich, and so he has to pull the other direction. He's pulling up to try to let people know that he's thriving, but he doesn't look like it based on the assumptions you would have about what wealth looks like.
Yeah, we all have stuff that we do to signal what we think is important people should know about us. I'm not this, I'm that. I'm this, I'm not over here, I'm not over there, I'm here, right? And it often is about a direction in which we want to be perceived. And it's often about, who do we want to think of us as going with them? Or who do we not want to think of us as going with them? So I want you to think about your values related to the following 3 ideas. And I'm going to tell you what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. I want you to think about values connected to cash, values connected to debt, and values connected to ownership. Your values connected to cash, your values connected to ownership, your values connected to ownership.
Yeah.
Debt. I wrote ownership twice. Cash, debt, and ownership. Here's what you're not allowed to do. because you're very, very smart people, you are not allowed to over intellectualize or theorize. I need you to think about your actual feelings about these things, not things like, well, I strive to live in a world where we no longer have cash. Okay, but like, what's your current relationship to it while it exists, right? Or I don't want you to say, I hate that during the housing crisis, people really got screwed over. So I get sad that there are people in debt. Okay, but what is your current relationship? So not the idea of these things out here, your relationship to them. What did people tell you growing up about cash, debt, and ownership? How do those things manifest in the choices you make now? What are you signaling to people about your relationship to cash and debt and ownership? What don't you want people to know? What do you feel is appropriate? What do you feel is inappropriate? What is for dinner conversations? What's not for dinner conversations? So really keep coming back to yourself, not other people, not ideas out here, not your hopes and dreams for the future world, but like right now, your relationship to those ideas. And I'm going to ask you to talk to your groups in a few minutes, but first, I'm just spend some quiet time reflecting on those three ideas. So if you haven't yet, start weaving in your experiences of race and gender and try to talk about your race and your gender connected to how those values, those stories are playing out for you today. What about your race and what about your gender are reinforcing, running toward, resisting, moving away from some of those values and some of those stories? Next layer. So how does this connect to your spirituality and how you engage at church? How does all of that, your class stories around cash and debt and ownership, plus your race and gender, we're at church. So how does all of that inform choices you make, how you engage with your spirituality, what you choose to do or not do in the context of church and spirituality? So layer that in. I'm going to ask you to bring this conversation to a close. I want you to just sit quietly with yourself and think, what did I notice? What did I notice about myself in that conversation? What did I notice about the other people? What did I notice about where I started and where I am now? What did I notice over the arc of that conversation? Just gather your thoughts for a moment. I asked you last week, where did you experience yourself expanding in that conversation? Where did you experience yourself contracting in that conversation? So think about that. Where did you feel yourself opening? Where did you feel yourself shrinking or closing? I'm going to invite you up. I need you to make 2 lines of 6 people. You can face each other close enough to hear the person in front of you. So 2 lines of 6 people facing each other. You won't have to touch.
Like this or like
I think let's send the line this way. There's more space here. 2 lines of 6 people close enough so you can hear the person in front of you. And share with the person across from you what you noticed about the conversation you were in. You don't need to repeat your story or anyone else's, but what did you notice? Where were you expanding? Where were you contracting? the whole purpose of this series was to engage complexity, to think about spiritual development, to think about social justice, to not be small in how we think of or experience or approach our work of justice, to really look closely at our own narratives, our own experiences, the ways in which we try to make complexity simple, to really think about not letting acts of justice be separate from our spiritual development. And so I want you to think about whether you came to 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of the sessions. I want you to think about the permission you're going to give yourself to practice something. There have been a few moments in the series where I've said, okay, the goal is not that you know all the things that I know and that you can say all the things I just said. The goal is, what will you practice? So it's not about more information. It's about practice. So if you need to mill around while you think about that, do that. If you need to write, do that. If you just want to sit quietly in your seat, do that. But think about one thing you want to give yourself permission to practice as we wrap the series. Take about. So we do this work together. We did it in groups. Like, we didn't just send out PDFs for you to quietly study at home, because you're a community. We talked about, I think when we talked about LGBTQ identities, gender and sexuality, I was talking about this thing that we do, which is assume that because we go to the same place, we have shared value, we have shared perspective. And part of the practice is regularly checking with each other about how we're experiencing our experience, and then asking, could I be thinking in a more complex way? Could we be trying to have this experience in a broader way? Not to dilute or minimize how anything landed for you, but when you're in conversation with each other, not assuming that the way that you perceived something was the way that other people perceived it. So how are we experiencing this together? So because we do this work together, I'm going to ask you to do something that may feel exciting for some, annoying to others, and everywhere on a spectrum, and it might feel vulnerable. I want you to find someone in the room, and I want you to schedule a conversation with them to tell them how that practice is going. So you just wrote down or thought about a practice you want to give yourself permission to do. I want you to schedule time in 1 month. Someone's going to tell me we're like really busy at the church that day, so it can't be April 14th. Great, it can be the 13th, it can be the 15th, but in about a month, I know y'all, I know. In about a month, whether it's, hey, meet me at Wellspring Wednesday and we'll talk for 5 minutes before and after. If it's, hey, I'll meet you in the lobby before after service on Sunday, or hey, let's have a phone call or grab a cup of coffee. How you do it and the length of it is up to you. Could be 5 minutes, could be on the phone, whatever you want to do. Find one person and schedule time to talk about how that practice is going. It can't be KP because he works here.